Reit, bore da, croeso cynnes iawn yma i'r Pierhead ar gyfer yn digwyddiad briffio ni. Fe newydd i Richard Wyn Jones, a dyma Jac Larner, fy nghyfaill a fy nghydweithiwr. A very warm welcome to you all to the Pierhead. Very impressed by the numbers who've turned up, especially those who were at the event last night as well. That's dedication beyond the call of duty. We're going to talk to you through what we think is some really exciting new data. Nobody's ever seen all of this stuff, except for you. So I think you're going to find it interesting. It's going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to take you through the data from the Welsh Election Study. Jack's going to do that. I'm just going to set the scene, and then there will be some stuff, an opportunity for some questions, but we'll try and keep it relatively concise because people have got other things to do. That Labour won the 2024 general election in Wales is probably the least surprising news story in political history. Labour have won every election in Wales since 1922. And yes, they won 84% of the seats in Wales. So, shock. However, under the surface, this was, I think, a really interesting election. So in terms of Labour, this was the only part of Britain where Labour actually went back, so lost vote share. In fact, as you'll see in a moment, it was one of their lowest vote shares in a UK general election, certainly when Labour have won. Vote share is really important because obviously we're moving to a new electoral system in Wales in 2026 where vote share is going to be all important. I think it's also important and significant that in every seat where there was a credible non-Labour challenger, the non-Labour party won. So I think it's a really interesting election from a Labour Party perspective. From the Tory party perspective, obviously it was catastrophic. It's not the first time in my political lifetime that we haven't had any Conservative MPs in Wales. They didn't have any MPs in Wales after the 1997 general election. They didn't have any seats in Wales after the 2001 general election. But what I think makes what happened in July particularly stark is that the Conservatives had what is arguably their best ever UK general election in the democratic era in 2019 in Wales. 2021 was their best ever Senedd election result. So to fall so far, so quickly, makes that complete failure very stark indeed. In terms of Plaid Cymru, for once we saw Plaid Cymru manage expectations successfully. So they, I think, managed to do better than the low expectations that people had in terms of vote share. And I've already mentioned that this becomes very significant moving forward to 2026. They managed to blood a new leader successfully. We've got some interesting data on that. And actually they won in target seats rather than falling short in target seats, which has been the Plaid tradition in recent years. So actually quite a good election for Plaid. And then we've got Reform, which we have some very interesting things to say to you about. So, I think, Jack, that is enough scene setting, and I'll let you just take over. And Jack, as the guy who does all the work, is going to do all the good stuff.
Long-running survey, voting age adults in Wales. We interview lots of people across Wales. This time, it was 2,500 people living in Wales, voting age adults before and then in the immediate aftermath of the election. So we can follow these people over time. We can also link it to all the previous surveys that we've done, right? So we've got this time series of voters now, the same people, seeing how things have changed, actually going back about 8 years. So a really, really valuable resource. Also, to blow our own, the data is really, really good. So we know, and I'm sure all of us are now aware of high-profile polling misses recently, some very recently. But for us, the average error in terms of what our data actually said the election was going to be like, average error was about 0.7% from the actual final result. That's considered very good, at least by people who do our sort of job. And pretty much all the error comes from, we had too many people who said they voted Reform rather than Conservatives, but otherwise data performs really, really well. Okay, so we're going to go through party by party. So Richard's done the top lines, the kind of history stuff, although there's lots more kind of historical moments we can point to as well. But first thing about the Conservatives, because in Wales, really the story was not any one party surging, apart from potentially Reform. It was actually Conservative drop-off pretty much everywhere. And so now we've got one of these graphs which election people love to show you, the alluvial plots, Sankey diagrams, whatever we call them, right? And they're the flow of voters. So on the left-hand side, you can see the chunk of voters from 2019, how people voted in 2019, and then where they moved to in the most recent election. And if we focus on the Conservatives here, right, we can see where their voters were going, moving away from. Okay, so a plurality, but only just stayed with the Conservatives, around 39%, 40%, but then almost equal numbers moved to Reform. Right, so this is where they lost the majority of their vote share, was to Reform. Also, kind of substantial levels going to Labour Party and also not voting. The other part which we don't show here was that actually a lot of 2019 Conservative voters died. And it sounds a very odd thing to say, but you're going to see why this is actually really important to start thinking about in the next few slides. So if we look demographically, I'm not sure you can actually read every label here, right? But basically, hopefully you can see the direction that every arrow is going, right? So we've got different demographic groups. We've got men, women, different age groups, social grade, national identity, what else have we got? Oh, education levels and household income. Essentially, the entire Conservative coalition, which they've done so well to build up from 2015, 2017, reaching that high point in 2019, the whole coalition collapsed. And in particular, the voters which moved towards the Conservative Party, especially during that Brexit era, and those are people in the C2DE social grade, right? People over 50, and in particular, people who feel British only or British and Welsh in Wales, it just collapsed. Basically, everybody moved away from them. But if we're going to look at one demographic group which really, I think, explains what's happened to the Conservative Party and what the risk is for the Conservatives moving forward, it would be thinking about age. So what we have here is the relationship between age and the probability of voting Conservative in the last 3 general elections in Wales. Okay, so you can see that there's always been this steep gradient. Young people generally have never voted for the Conservative Party. This has been true since at least the 80s, this kind of steep level, right? But there are some interesting things here that you can probably see, right? So the first thing is that we've got this dotted line running across. And this is the tipping point where, over a certain age, the majority of these people actually vote Conservatives. So in 2017 and 2019, it was about 72 and over, right? And that's actually quite a big chunk of the electorate because these people turn out in very, very, very high numbers, okay? It's about 72. In 2024, in order to get to that number, it's 94 years old. And essentially that means there's nobody, right? Because actually that's just a couple of people in our data, essentially. But the real thing is the rest of this curve. Where we say, in Wales, less than 10% of under 65s voted for the Conservative Party in 2024. This is a huge, huge drop-off. So some of this is just losing younger voters, and we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail in a second, but also we talked about, and it is important, and some of you, is this differential dying rate. In that, Conservatives, around 10% of 2019 Conservative voters passed away, and that compares to about 3% of Labour voters, and that's because they're already stacked in the age group, and assuming a similar age gradient carries on, by the next general election, 40% of 2019 Conservative voters will probably have passed away. And they're not replacing them. They're not replacing it with new, younger voters. We're going to talk about that with Reform. But it's not just a general kind of age thing, right? These are older people. They also don't like young people. So in the WES, we created something called a scale of generational resentment. And it's basically how much you don't like young people or you don't like old people. Well, for the Conservatives, it's off the scale. right? Basically, the more you hate young people, the higher the probability that you vote Conservative. So not only are remaining Conservative voters very old, right, they also don't like any young people. This isn't a great idea for the future of a political party, right? So they're in a real bind now as a party. Next, we'll focus on Labour. Don't worry, we can keep coming back to the Conservatives over time as well. Labour. So, as Richard said, a bit of an old one for Labour in that they won emphatically more than double the vote share of any other party, vast majority of seats, extended this incredible running kind of tally to, it's now obscenely the longest successful kind of democratic run in the democratic world in history. Crazy things to say. We get bored of saying them, I think, but often we should pause and think about how remarkable that is. But they also lost votes, and that's important to remember, right? So they actually lost votes in this election. And again, thinking where these votes went to, so majority did stay with the Labour Party, but where they lost the most votes to were Plaid Cymru. Around 12% of 2019 voters voted for Plaid Cymru, to the Green Party, and then some non-voters as well. These voters did not, as I think some people in kind of popular explanations have already kind of started to say, move to Reform. Like that wasn't really a big vote flow. These are not Labour voters moving from Labour to Reform. They're going elsewhere. Now, of course, they did pick up votes from the Conservatives and other parties as well, but they did lose votes overall. And why is this the case? Well, in Wales, what we've seen is actually Labour have started, potentially, finally, you might say, to pay the price of governing. And competence seemed to really matter for the Labour Party. So one thing that we saw is a growing gap in polls between the percentage of people who say they vote Labour at Westminster and the same people who say they vote Labour in a devolved election. The gap is growing. So the same people are kind of splitting their ticket at different levels. And when we start to look at issues and competence evaluations, I think we can start to see why. So here what we have is just a general question, right? So how good or bad a job have the Conservatives or Welsh Labour done of running the UK or Wales? So the blue bar, kind of here, obviously for the Conservatives is absolutely abysmal, right? And explains this kind of entire drop-off that they've had. But the data is also very bad for the Welsh Government, right? And if we actually look at it over time, we can see that this has been getting much worse. Now, the two actually move in sync. They follow pretty much exactly the same pattern. Perceptions of the UK government are always worse, right? But the direction of travel in Wales is that the Labour Party, people are being more and more critical to the point where in 2014, a majority of people for the first time said that they thought the Welsh Labour government was doing a bad job of running Wales. We can also look at kind of some of the issues that people ask. So here we asked people to write in their own words. There's no prompting, no priming. This happens early on in the survey. What's the most important issue facing the country? Right, so this isn't kind of issues that we've decided to test out. We're letting people write in themselves. And these are the top most common, these are the top 10 mentions, right? So at the top we have the NHS, again, a devolved issue. Then we've got cost of living and the economy. You could combine these two, I suppose, really, to think about one thing. And then immigration. But then the fifth most, biggest issue that people mentioned in their own words was actually writing in about the First Minister of Wales and Vaughan Gething at the time. He was very unpopular. And some people still argue it didn't really cut through. In the data, it really cut through. These are people writing in their own words that the most pressing concern facing Wales is the First Minister. And then actually the ninth issue is speed limits again. So people were writing in these things. But I think this shows the problem with the branding of Welsh Labour for the first time, which was previously always been a boon to the Labour Party in Wales, actually started to become a drag on them. We can also ask people, how has the standard of different things changed over the last 5 years? Health service, education, law and order, standard of living, all these things getting worse, unsurprisingly, and really getting worse over time, in particular, standard of living and health. But again, who are people blaming here for these differences? Well, more and more people are starting to blame the Welsh Government for all of these issues. So if we look at this over time, you can see in the top corner here, more and more people are now blaming the Welsh Government for the health service, the most pressing issue in Wales, okay? Also for education, but also it's starting to creep up for things like the standard of living, things which in the past the Welsh Government have always had a pass on, right? Because people say, oh, maybe the economy, they don't really have any ability to kind of change what's actually going on. The Welsh Labour government are starting to be blamed more and more for all of these issues. And so this, we think, is what explains why Labour struggled. I mean, when we say struggled relative to their 100 years of winning in Wales. So Plaid Cymru. So, as Richard said, actually a solid, one of the few parties, Plaid Cymru, who can actually be pretty happy. And the story for them, kind of in terms of who their voters are and things, is pretty much the same as it normally is, right? Welsh speakers in particular, people who feel very Welsh, who don't feel very, very British. But there was also a few things in this election which I think they'll be very, very happy about. And the first is that their leader got cut through. Rhys Iwerddon got cut through. He became the most popular leader of any political party in Wales. So if you can't see the kind of rankings there, it's Rhys, Ed Davey, Keir Starmer, and then a big drop-off, and you've got these kind of four clustered together, Vaughan Gething, R.T. Davies, Farage, and then Sunak being the least popular. But one thing that you normally see with Plaid leaders is that, yes, they do actually tend to be very popular, but then also a lot of people don't know who they are, right? And so the popularity is kind of inflated by basically Plaid members who know who he is, saying that they like him a lot. This time, there seems to be a lot more cut through. So actually about 75% of people actually said that they had an opinion on Rhys Iwerddon. This is much better than it's been in the past. And it's kind of going to the levels that Leanne Wood enjoyed, right, during the high points of some of the UK debates in 2015 in particular. So you've got a popular leader who had cut through. But I suppose the main thing for Plaid Cymru is, yes, they held, or rather, they won their 4 target seats. They now hold the 2 safest constituencies in Wales in terms of majority. Caerdydd, as recent as 2015, was considered, a pretty tight race. Not really anymore. But for Plaid, really, it's about looking forward and what's happened going forward, right? So a few things. Oh, as well as the people liking the leader, people also generally like Plaid as a party. So what we've got here is different dots on kind of, and we ask people to rate parties on a 0 to 10 scale, how much you like them, dislike them, and here we've got by how they voted. So as you can see, Plaid are relatively popular among Labour voters, among Liberal Democrat voters as well. Combined, this is the majority of voters in Wales, right? So they're relatively popular. A few other things here, not to do with Plaid, but I think worth pointing out is the big thing here around reform voters, right? So for a lot of Conservatives, they have this idea that we can just win these voters back next time. Right, they're kind of, we're the natural home for most of these voters. And as you saw in the kind of alluvial plots that we did, actually a lot of these voters did come from the Conservative Party. They voted for them in 2019. But actually, Reform voters don't like the Conservatives either. They're quite hostile to them as well. So there's not that kind of natural marriage there. But going back to Plaid as well, it's all really about thinking for the future and the next devolved election. So what we have here is another alluvial, another very pretty diagram, right, which shows... we asked the people in the Welsh Election Study how they voted in 2024, and then we asked them immediately next, if it was a Senedd election, how would you have voted? Okay, and what we actually see is a huge proportion of voters, I say huge, relative to kind of trends that we've seen in the past, of Labour voters saying that they vote for Plaid Cymru. And actually, in Senedd vote intention, you can't see the figures, but we have Labour at 22%, and then Plaid at 21%. So almost neck and neck when it comes to Senedd voting intention. And these are the same people that we're asking, right? The same people asking to think about 2 distinct electoral contests. And this is the real kind of potential game for Plaid. And thinking about how we would, what would this mean in terms of the 2026 devolved election? Well, here what we've done is just actually kind of done some modelling using this data to say, like, how would the Senedd look in terms of seats? With these numbers under the new system. So using the same vote totals from 2021, you can see that Labour do very well, 44, Conservatives 26, Plaid Cymru 24, etc., etc. But the lighter bars here show what would happen under with these current numbers that we have, right? So Labour would win 31 seats, Plaid 28. So again, very, very close. And actually, those final few seats are all well within the margin of error. So we're in the tipping point now, if these figures stay the case. I mean, obviously, we've not actually had any vote intention data since since post-election, but we do have some coming relatively soon, so we'll see, I suppose. And obviously the other big thing here, right, which can't go unmentioned, is this chunk for reform, right? And that's what we're going to talk about now. So Reform UK did very, very well from a very low base, finished second in many, many constituencies, especially across South Wales and the valleys in particular, where they launched their manifesto event. I think tomorrow, is that right? They've got their event in Newport in South Wales as well. So really targeting this area. So given that pretty much all of Reform voters, a vast majority, previously voted Conservative, what we've done is done a model, right? Okay, what distinguishes people who voted Reform from people who voted for the Conservative Party? So I'm just going to walk you through what this means here, right? So the first thing to notice, and that we've already talked about, is age. So just as an explainer, if these dots are to the left of this dotted line, it means they're less likely to vote Reform, right? If they're to the right, it means that they're more likely to vote Reform. But with age, what this is saying is that young people, right? This is the big divider between Conservative and Reform voters, is age. As we've talked about age repeatedly here to the Conservative Party. And this isn't like, 21-year-olds and 22-year-olds voting Reform. The key demographic here is people aged 35 to 55 in particular, right? 3 to 1, they go to Reform. Really, really big swings in this age. And if we look at dividing this again by gender, in particular, it's young men, or younger men, right, who are moving towards Reform and not the Conservatives. So again, age being a really, really big thing here. Thinking about national identity, always important in Wales. We'll talk about a bit more about that in a minute as well. People who feel British and English or British and Welsh, they were slightly more likely to vote Reform compared to the Conservatives. But the other really big, or the biggest effect of all, is being more left-wing. Reform voters are economically more left-wing, right? On social values, it doesn't seem to matter, right? They're about the same. But Reform voters are more economically left-wing. And if you think about where Reform do very, very well, it's in post-industrial areas, the valleys in particular, right, where there are a lot of economically left-wing, socially conservative voters for whom the Conservative brand is still toxic. And so regardless of how closely ideologically aligned they might be with the Conservative Party, they'll never vote for the Conservative Party because of the branding. But Reform doesn't have that baggage, right? And it's also distinct, thinking about age and also this ideological element. This is different to UKIP's kind of coalition that they enjoyed in Wales, which tended to be right-wing and older than kind of the average Conservative voter. It's flipped around when it comes to Reform. And then the other thing which distinguishes Reform voters from everyone else is that, or rather Conservative voters, is that they think Brexit's gone badly. Right? So it's the percentage of people by votes who say that the UK government's done a bad job of Brexit. 40% of Conservative voters say that, right? But 70% of Reform voters. And it's not that they are against Brexit, they just don't think it's been done properly. That's the idea, yeah. Okay, so long-term trends. So we've gone through all the parties, kind of the top lines, now talk about some of the long-term trends. Now, Wales isn't immune to many of the long-term demographic trends we've seen elsewhere, right? In the UK, or just kind of general Western democracies, things like a growing educational divide we're seeing, right? Growing age divides, a realignment of what it means to be working class and how that means, and how that relates to politics. But the one distinct thing that we do have in Wales, compared to the rest of the UK anyway, is national identity. I know we bang about this all the time in Wales events, right? But it is really important, and we're seeing big changes in Wales when it comes to national identity. One of the things that makes Wales so unique is that we have lots of different national identity groups, right? So we've got people who feel British and English, British and Welsh, people who feel British who were born in England, people who feel British but were born in Wales, they're very, very different. People who feel English, people who say, oh, I'm some sort of other identity, I kind of reject any of these labels, and then people who feel Welsh only. And how these groups have changed over time, well, if we look at the kind of groups which are declining, people who feel British and English, British and Welsh, or people who feel British only who are born in England, all these groups are declining over time, especially since 2016 and the EU referendum. In terms of the groups that are growing, the biggest growing group is people who feel Welsh only. Now, some of this is related to age, right? Young people don't feel British, they do feel Welsh, so you have this replacement. And also the growth of this other identity. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because why this is important is that all these groups link quite closely to politics and ideology. So in the next plot, what we've done is plot these groups, right, on this kind of vote compass kind of style map. So we've got left-right ideology along the bottom, liberal authoritarian or social values on the vertical axis. And you see in 2016, there are differences, right, with the Welsh-only group being the most left-wing, the other group being the most socially liberal, but they're all kind of clustered together. But since 2016, we've seen these groups really start to grow apart. So in 2021, we can start to see what's happening here, right? So people who feel very Welsh are becoming more left-wing, more socially liberal. People who feel other, a lot more socially liberal. And then we see those other groups, this kind of cluster of people who feel English and only British and English, the people who feel British but born in Wales, all start to become more right-wing. And by 2024, we see huge polarization between these groups, real differences in ideology emerging. So people who feel very Welsh have become very, very left-wing economically and far more socially liberal than they were in 2016. This other group have become very socially liberal, probably the most socially liberal group in the whole of Britain, if the data is to be believed. And then these other groups, people who feel British but who are born in Wales, have become incredibly right-wing, one of the most right-wing groups, again, in Britain. Which I think is interesting. So the division in Wales, people who are born in Wales, is on this left-right spectrum, and there is obviously this gap on socially liberal values as well. But people who are born in England, they're growing further apart in terms of kind of these social values. So here, even though they look almost identical on left-right values, socially they're kind of growing apart. And the other thing that's happening is this other group here. And what seems to be happening, or seems to have happened rather, since 2016, is that people who are socially liberal or more left-wing, they've abandoned essentially the term British or English since 2016. Since the EU referendum, they no longer identify as either British or English, and now they kind of say, well, I'm some sort of other identity. And this is why we've seen that this group has kind of become a lot more socially liberal, because essentially all the social liberals are moving to this group. What's remaining are just kind of socially conservatives and economically conservatives, which is why these other groups are all moving to the right. And the Welsh only, it's essentially just lots and lots of young people joining this group. And now we have, I think, a final slide. You can't actually probably see this, right? But this is how all these different groups voted. So this is why I'm going to talk about why this matters, right? So we've seen how these different groups are kind of changing in their size over time. So looking at first at this kind of this big group here, British and English, British and Welsh, people who feel and people who feel British only but born in Wales, right? These are the places where the Conservatives still do very well, but, well, relatively well, not very well, relatively well, but these are the groups that are shrinking. These are the groups that are shrinking over time, right? And at the moment, we don't have any reason to think why these groups would suddenly start to grow. And it could happen, of course. But the other thing is this group here, the Welsh only and other identity. This is, again, the key to kind of Welsh Labour's success, right? They always do very, very well in these groups. These are the groups that are growing over time, right? So that they're kind of mopping up here. But also, I suppose, the key thing, the promising thing for Plaid is that in this Welsh only group, at a Westminster election, they're now nearly drawing parity. This is the largest of any national identity group in Wales. They're drawing parity with the Labour Party at a general election, a Westminster election. So I think we can say at a Senedd election, the likelihood is that they will pull ahead in this group. For Plaid, however, they are still kind of restricted to this group doing very well, this group doing okay. They don't do very well in these other groups. These big blue bars make it look like the Conservatives are doing very well, but these are all very, very, very small groups. Okay, so again, national identity changes that are occurring in Wales really are going to have a very important role in kind of explaining the changes, political changes that we're going to see in Wales over the next few years. And that's it from me. I mean, I do have lots of other emergency slides if we do have any extra questions, but I was told I had to kind of stop it at that point. But diolch, yeah, thank you.
Okay, diolch yn fawr. That was fantastic. Diolch, Jack. We've got actually about half an hour, so we've been powering through that. If people need to leave, we know that people have got lives and jobs and stuff. So if people need to leave, don't, you know, just go. Don't feel that you're obligated to stay. Questions, comments? If you can introduce yourself, just say who you are. We won't assume that everybody knows who everybody is. The gentleman by the column, there's a microphone roving, so if you can wait. Dechraw'r.
Thanks. That was great, Jack. Thanks very much. My name is Steve Davis. One quick question. Can you say a little bit more about the proportions of the electorate that the different national identity groups comprise?
Yeah, sure. So you mean like percentages for each one sort of thing? Yeah, so I can go back to the slide, actually. That's the useful thing about this, isn't it? Yeah, so the biggest group, Welsh only, is about 32% of the electorate by now. British and Welsh, which used to be the biggest group before the EU referendum, I think that's around 24% now. Other identity is about 18%, so about 18% of people kind of reject any of these labels, or rather don't feel really, really strongly attached to one of these labels in particular. The smallest group is English only. I mean, there's actually about 2 or 3% in Wales actually say, I'm English only, not at all British. And then, while I can see the graph, I can't actually remember the actual figures, the rest of it, but I hope that's enough.
The context, Steve, is that 27% of the Welsh electorate are born in England, so there's a demographic context to all of this. Diolch. Next question.
Hello, fechgyn, shwmai, Gwarn Gwynfil. Can I ask the turnout question? Because turnout is obviously in decline, 56% in the general, I think 44% for the last Senedd election. Do you measure at all who isn't voting and why they're not voting and how that's changed over time? And perhaps more importantly, how do the political parties in Wales energise those voters to get them back into the fray?
Yeah, yes, so we do look at this. So there is a caveat that it's probably likely, right, that people who don't turn out to vote are less likely to take part in surveys. So we probably have a small bias. So with that, although we are actually working to fix that on the next one, with Joe, who's sat right there. But yes, so we can look at it. And again, I have an emergency slide, because I thought this might come up. So there's a few things which always affect turnout kind of everywhere that aren't specific to anywhere. And one of the things is kind of competitiveness, right? So basically, how much do you think your vote is likely to influence the outcome of an election? Now, we didn't have many competitive constituencies, essentially, in this election. You can see this kind of a relationship here, right, between the margin of victory and the level of turnout. So basically, the less competitive it was, fewer people turn out to vote, because why would you bother turning out to vote, you know, late at night? The other thing we know is that people didn't perceive there to be a big ideological difference between the two main parties, and we know that always affects turnout, right? If there's not, again, the stakes aren't raised because you think, you know, one party's really, really far away from where you are. But as always, again, the thing which really correlates with, unfortunately, with not voting are things like low efficacy. So basically thinking that no one's going to listen to you anyway, you don't have any power to change anything, all these kinds of things, satisfaction with democracy. And then also the single biggest kind of factor is, depending on what measure you want to use, but whether you want to use deprivation or low income or any of those things. So, I mean, those things are very, very difficult to fix. But in terms of offering kind of a more competitive election or something like that, well, I mean, I suppose technically that's up to the parties. But, you know, potentially moving to with a Senedd election, I think in the absence of automatic registration, we likely would have had very, very high turnout. Now we don't know because we've got kind of the actual figure might look a bit different. Do you want to say?
No, all I was going to say is this is always been a preoccupation of ours, and it's a very, very difficult thing to research for the reasons that Jack mentioned. But we've got this big idea for the 2026 Senedd election. So if we actually get the survey, we're going to expend a lot of effort in trying to get at non-participants in a very innovative way, because obviously this is a huge issue and we're aware that it's a big blind spot, not just for the Welsh Election Study, but for all election studies. So we're going to try and do something quite radical about it in 2026. So hopefully we'll be able to say a lot more about this.
Yeah, and I should say as well, the biggest difference between Westminster and Senedd elections is that Conservative supporters don't turn out. And there's kind of two reasons. You can split it into two. One is they are more and more devo-skeptic. They're more hostile to the idea of devolution, so they just don't want to take part in kind of what's happening. But then the other thing is that they just don't think they're going to win, right? And mathematically, they almost never are. It's just like, why play the game if you can't win? And so for a lot of them, they stay home, so like, well, I know who's going to win, right? And so that's also the big thing, yeah.
Okay, next. Here we go.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you. That's a great presentation. Thank you, Jack.
And please present yourself.
I will, yes. Yes. So I'm Joe Carter, and to declare an interest, I'm a Liberal Democrat councillor. And that's my question, actually, so which I thought we should probably guess when he looked at me. So I've noticed you kind of skipped over the Lib Dems, only the Greens, in terms of their vote share and swings, apart from obviously the big chart. I wonder if you could elaborate more on that, and particularly thinking about, we talk about Labour underperforming, thinking about the huge swings of Labour in Brecon Radnor and Cwm Tower, and obviously in Montgomeryshire and Glyndŵr as well, which is there anything other than local factors, any kind of significant demographic issues there we should be thinking about at all?
For the Liberal Democrats?
Well, about for Labour in terms of the Labour swings towards in those two seats.
Yeah, so thinking about the Liberal Democrats, I mean, more and more our problem with the Liberal Democrats is that we don't have many of them in our samples because there aren't many natural Liberal Democrat supporters anymore. And so what you saw in Brecon and Radnor was obviously a very concentrated campaign on tactical voting. And again, I think I have a slide on tactical voting. Here, when we basically ask people, why did you vote for the party you voted for? So there was kind of sincere voting, people who say, oh yeah, I actually really love this party, they're my favourite. People who say, well, I'm voting for the individual candidate, right, regardless of party. And then people who say, well, it's tactical. And you can see right there for the Liberal Democrats, right, you know, more than any other party, people are voting for them tactically. In areas where they used to be very, very strong, again, like Caerdydd, for example, we almost have nobody in our sample anymore. Those voters have kind of gone. So, I mean, it's an odd one for the Liberal Democrats, right? And you know, there's not much good news for them in terms of, other than when they're able to kind of convince people tactically to vote for them, people do in like big numbers. In terms of the result in Mont, well, I mean, there was one thing that was happening.
Williams.
Yeah, right. So the swing away from the Conservatives on average was about 16-17% in Wales, but there it was ludicrous. It was something like 30. I can't actually remember, but it was massive. It was absolutely huge. But it was essentially all because of local factors there. And for the Greens, again, similarly, we just don't have loads of them in our sample because actually they're very geographically kind of concentrated. So in Newport and Cardiff South in particular, right, we can't pick up on loads of those, but they do particularly well. I mean, that other group, right? So people who, again, are socially progressive, but they often don't feel they can opt into kind of some sort of Welsh identity or Welsh party, and so those are the sorts of people who vote Green in Wales.
The other thing I just add on for both of those parties is that thinking about 2026, where vote share is going to be key, and you know it's a high threshold, it's a 12% threshold in these super constituencies. It's going to, the Lib Dems and the Greens on these numbers are going to struggle hugely nationally. And the question is there anywhere where they can actually, have they got enough local strength? But this new voting system is actually very, very tricky for both the Lib Dems and the Greens, as you well know. There's one in the back and then there's one right in the front here afterwards, Richard, in front of the pillar.
Bro, thanks. Joe Roster from the IWA. Two questions, really. First question is, you've noticed this sea change in people's deviations between people's voting intention at a UK general election and a Welsh election, and also people kind of opening up to understanding that, well, blaming Welsh government for poor public sector services, for example. What do you think was the key contributors to that? Is it Vaughan Gething actually had a much bigger cut through than what, you know, some people might have thought? Or was it that people are having a bit more of a recognition of poor public sector delivery in Wales, and has that had more cut through than we thought? Second question is, we've heard a lot over the last couple of weeks about the Welsh Conservatives and lots of party members being interested in abolishing the Senedd. Is that electorally advantageous for them? Where's that coming from? I don't know if your survey looked at it or not, but be interested to see.
Yeah, so first one. Well, we'll split the first question. So I'd say in terms of why people are starting to blame Welsh Government, well, or Welsh Labour, or however we're going to say it, a big thing there is actually COVID, in that COVID really raised people's awareness of what's evolved or not, because for every day, right, in terms of health, you were seeing on the telly or whatever, it was a Welsh Labour politician, right, talking about health. Similar with schools. Everybody, like now, the vast majority of people know that education has devolved, and it's because parents were having to deal with Welsh Government stuff, again, during COVID. So actually, even though at the time, Welsh Government actually really benefited from COVID relatively, in that electorally, in that people thought they were doing a very good job relative to UK Government, kind of actually some of those same things are now coming back to hurt them, right? Because people know exactly who's in charge. Sometimes the ambiguity helped them in the past. And actually, they would have got kind of a pass on that. Do you want to do the second part of the...
Well, I just to add to that, I think it's interesting that what has been the Welsh Labour play of basically blaming Westminster, which is not an implausible, in terms of funding, it's not an implausible line to take. I mean, it's not one we expect to hear much from Eluned Morgan moving forward, but it was, it has a plausibility. That just stopped working in the same way that it used to. And that's really very, very difficult for Labour. In terms of, I guess you're inviting me to say something about the Vaughan situation.
Exactly.
Well, I think lots of people in the Labour Party, especially behind us, remain in deep denial about how toxic Vaughan Gethin was. Our data isn't brilliant because we don't do much polling in Wales, and so we don't have the density of data that you might have in other contexts. But in our election study, the number of people who've actually gone to the trouble of writing in how outraged they were is really very, very striking, and underlines, and his lack of popularity compared to Rhyn ap Iorwerth. He's down, the data is really awful for them. I think one of the kind of questions that we have as a team is we don't have any data on Eluned Morgan, and we're looking forward to having some very soon. And it'll be fascinating to see what's in there, because I think there are lots of people behind us, in the building behind us, who assume that Eluned Morgan is actually popular. I have seen no evidence either way to support that claim, but we shall soon know.
Yeah, just to emphasise that, the write-ins is really rare. It's very rare that you get lots of people coherently writing in kind of anything. NHS is very easy to type, so you always get people write NHS, right? And it is important. But for Vaughan to have more write-in mentions unprompted than education, housing, transport, that's something going on there. And in terms of the 0 to 10 ratings, he's within 0.05 on his average 0 to 10 of Nigel Farage, who's very unpopular. He was really unpopular. The question now on the Conservatives and tilting towards either abolish or more Devo-scepticism, well, it's very popular in their base. Really, really popular. Their Conservative supporters are really Devo-sceptic, but it's really limiting for them, because outside of that, there is not at the moment, or we have no evidence of any sort of swell of Devo-scepticism. Now, the proportion of people who say that they want to abolish the Senedd has risen since the EU referendum by a few points, but by almost equal measure so as people who say they support independence. So we are having some polarisation on constitutional issues, but again, it's very limiting. And I think it was very telling and very smart that Nigel Farage came out and said that they were not in favour of abolishing, because suddenly now they've not locked themselves off to this 15-16% of the electorate who feel very passionate about getting rid of devolution. The modal position, or the mean position in Wales, is actually more powers. So I think it's very smart of reform to,
Well, we even had Oliver Lewis. I don't know if he's got any influence in Brexit. I'm not sure he knows he's got any influence, but he was actually open to the case of more powers I mean, so yeah, so the Conservatives, if the Conservatives' target is to hoover up the abolish voters, then, you know, that is a tiny, I mean, that's not a winning coalition, shall we put it like that. And it's also not going to, with this age issue that they have, it's not at all helpful for them in terms of age. So yes, if you want to play to the over 90s, knock yourself out. But if you're actually interested in younger voters, this is not a sensible place to be going. And it's ironic, it's younger Conservatives who seem to think that this is a very good idea, which shows, I think, how out of touch younger Conservatives are. Anyway, we've got a question in the front here. And then...
Thank you, diolch yn fawr iawn. I'm Ben, I'm currently on the Master's programme with Richard at the minute. I wanted to ask more about the demographic makeup of that other group, because we distinguish between Welsh not British and then British not English. Do we know if that group is more coming from people from England who've moved in? Is that part of that 27% of the electorate born in England? Or is it from other places? Or is it people born in Wales abandoning these concepts of identity?
It's about 86% are born in England of that group. So like vast majority of people who are born in England. And if you track them over time, they used to say they were British, essentially. And now they don't. Then there's about, I think it's about 9%, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's about 9% then who then were born outside of the UK altogether. And then the rest is people born in Wales. But overwhelmingly, it's people born in England who are opting out of either English or British identity often for political reasons.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we want to do is look under the bonnet a bit, because these are strong identifiers. These are people on a scale of 0 to 10 who are very high in terms of national identity. It'd be interesting to see what's happening, and you know, at the kind of levels of the 3 and 4 out of 10, to see what's going on there. Are some of them adopting a Welsh identity, or you know? So we've got more work to do to tease out what's going on there. This is a.
Well, they're not political refugees in that they don't have a natural political party, because all of them go towards Labour, essentially. But in terms of national identity, they sort of are. Yeah, I mean, they've often cast off one set of identities, but they don't feel like they're able to say that they're Welsh, essentially, even though on many, many measures, politically, they look very similar to people who say they're Welsh.
This is something that is obviously something that we need to take more of an interest in, because this has grown quite a lot over time. So we've done a lot to work on these other groups, but now we've got to delve more into this group. So, you know, watch this space. Right, Helen over here.
I'm Helen. I'm also on the Master's programme. I'm fascinated by the correlations and things in some of this. But in terms of causation, I have to say, I'm one of those people that probably in the past would have said I was Welsh and British. I think after today, I'm not sure I ever dare say that again. But, you know, to what extent is this people sort of attributing being British as a sort of English kind of a thing, and therefore I want to get away from this? Or is it, no, Welsh is strong enough now that I don't have to be British? Or you know, what do we know about why people are changing how they would describe themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's messy. In that there's not a simple kind of way that this is happening, because a lot of the time what seems to be happening, and we don't have regular enough data to always track this, but people are changing their values and their identity at the same time, so it's not entirely clear which one's driving which. So I mean that it's very difficult to identify the exact causal direction on that. We do know that so some work that I've done with someone called James Griffiths, who used to be on WES and now is working on the British Election Study, that in the aftermath of the EU referendum, people who voted Remain became less British. And that was the same everywhere. So we know there that this one event, because we can actually track it, we have the good enough data, right, caused people to feel less British. Not more Welsh in that case, or more Scottish or anything like that. But British identity really dropped, and it stayed like kind of suppressed, basically. They've not picked it back up. We saw the same thing in Scotland after the Scottish referendum. People who voted yes became less British, and again, that over time has not kind of come back. So again, we know those events kind of definitely had an impact, but in terms of the moving of values and ideology and politics and identity, it's a bit more tricky.
Yeah, and I mean, as you will know, Helen, this is a source of particular fascination to me. And for me, the British, not Welsh, the people born in Wales who eschew Welsh identity and identify as British are, the most fascinating group. I always say that if Wales were to become independent, they're the equivalent of the people who moved to Ontario in the late 18th century and still fly the Union Jack. This is a fascinating group, and they've become so right-wing. It's just...
So they're actually growing slightly as well. Slightly, this British group who were born in Wales. But as you can see, it almost broke the scale. So you can see them in 2017. I tried to keep everything looking the same, so we have these nice smooth transitions. But it almost became impossible with the British people who feel British born in Wales because they became so right-wing over the last 8 years.
Yeah. Anyway, so we've got more to do. But next question is here.
Do we know why more people, particularly younger people, I think, are identifying as Welsh?
No. You're the talent.
Well, so there's not again one simple answer. There seems to be loads of things. I mean, yeah, sport probably. Yeah, I mean, we actually don't have the data, but I bet sport probably has actually played some impact. But the general idea across the whole, so it's actually a trend you see across the whole of the UK. Younger people feel less British. In England, it's slightly more complicated, as Richard will probably tell you all about. But in Scotland, it's the same. And in Northern Ireland, it's the same, because young people in Northern Ireland now say they're Northern Irish, rather than the same sort of people. But here, there's a general theory, and we don't know it for certain, right? But that essentially there's things like distance from the war, for example, right? No memory of the war. We have no memory of coming together, all this kind of stuff, this collective British identity. Things like EU referendum have made a big impact, right? Where people think that essentially that was young people basically didn't want to leave. They see that in Wales anyway, at least as a British idea. In England, they see it as an English. Yeah, it's complicated, but those are some areas. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to buy the book on Englishness, obviously. But no, there's right. Richard Martin is waving his hand in the back, which means we've got to draw this to a close. Thank you so much for joining us. To do so at 8 a.m. is very impressive. We're really grateful. Please take some pastries as you go, otherwise there's going to be a huge food wastage, which we don't approve of. This presentation will be available online in about, Richard, guesstimate? Wow, that's incredible. So these data, you will be able to see the slides more easily online. But thank you so much. We're going to be doing much more of much more analysis, and we'll be seeing many of you in different events moving forward. But we're very grateful to you, and I'm particularly grateful to Jac for doing all the work and making this presentation look fantastic. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Cofiwch fynd â bwyd efo chi, a welwn i chi'n fuan. Hwyl fawr, tara.